Hey folks, so we haven't, I don't think, actually done a Facebook
I
Live.
think this is our first one.
We've been on other folks' Facebook Lives. We've had a lot of questions relating to keto and hitting your fat or protein macro needs. And so we just kind of wanted to talk about that. And then clearly, if you guys have questions, go ahead and fire those off to us. And yeah, we'll hopefully try not to make this too big of a train wreck. So
well, and we've gotten a couple pieces of feedback about the Keto Masterclass, and the trend seems to be that people are actually really surprised that the number one thing that they did that actually resulted in a significant change was focusing on hitting their protein target. So I have a couple things that I want to read, and then we can discuss further. So the first gal, Lisa, she's down 15 pounds and 20 inches. She's super stoked. She doesn't have any cravings anymore. But the main thing that she says, she's like, the material was so helpful, and I learned I needed to hit my protein goal for success. Prior, I thought it was the fat macro I had to hit. So there's one. And then actually just yesterday, we received an email from Adam, who we're going to put his whole testimonial on the website because it's actually really touching and just an amazing story. Struggled with weight his whole life, likens being in an overweight body to just being a prisoner.
Right.
And like it's really heartfelt,
pretty powerful,
a powerful testimonial. Yeah. But he says, here is a short list of what I discovered that may help others in keto if they are struggling. Number one, I was eating too much fat. I wasn't eating copious amounts, just enough oils on my food that my body didn't need to dip into its reserves. People need to change the misconception that you can eat all the fat you want and still lose weight. Number two, I wasn't taking in enough protein and had to readjust to eating more food. This probably had the biggest impact on me, as I'd always shied away from working out on keto because it would kick off major food cravings in the form of high-carb food. This in turn would derail me for a few days, and with the new adjustments I made to my protein intake, the cravings have seemed to completely disappear. Admittedly, my workouts are still light, but I try to get in some type of movement, exercise in the form of stretching, walking, blah, 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 and plan on hitting it harder when the weather warms up. And finally, number three, electrolytes. Your drink is a lifesaver. I struggled with cramps on keto, and within a few days, they were a thing of the past. The list above are just the highlights of what I learned in your course. I just wanted to point out the things that have had a major impact on my success up to this point. I still have a long way to go, but I know it's only a matter of time. So I know you've been answering a lot of questions that have popped up both on Facebook and some of our ads. And there seems to be this like vicious debate.
We had a comment that from someone that was like, fats are more important, you know, and man, so you don't want to make this thing into like religious dogma, because this is where the internet just inevitably seems to go. But there is kind of a reality that some things work better than others. And what I don't think people fully appreciate is that the feedback that we are getting from people, the people who have either never been able to affect weight loss, you know, throughout their whole life, and or they've been trying some sort of ketogenic diet approach and they've failed. The thing that ends up shifting for them is that they finally focus on the protein macro. They set the fat macro appropriate, which we lean heavily on the Keto Gains macronutrient calculator for the Keto Masterclass. And suddenly these people are super successful. And there are different ways of doing this. There are certainly compelling reasons for people who are managing a neurodegenerative disease. If they
therapeutic, there's a difference between like a therapeutic ketogenic diet and people who do ketogenic diets for fat loss.
Right. And so people get really prickly about this, you know. And what's interesting, though, is that even within this context of a protein-centric ketogenic diet, which, again, I would say that the Keto Gains guys are kind of laudable in that regard, it still ends up being a high-fat diet. It's high-fat, but with a caloric ceiling, because you can, in fact, overeat on a ketogenic diet. And it is... I was one of those people that I could eat what seemed to be almost unlimited amounts of fat and not gain weight on a ketogenic diet, you know, especially compared to eating a higher carb diet in the past. But then I found that the interesting thing is I definitely have more buffer between gaining weight and not gaining weight on a ketogenic diet. Like I've got a little more latitude in that regard. it seems like I can overeat and not suffer the same type of downsides, but relative to a higher carb diet. But if I really want to be lean, then I just have to manage the fat intake. I can't do bulletproof coffees all day long. She makes a really cool kind of banana bread that with almond meal and all this stuff. And when we had Zoe, she made a bunch of this stuff, and then we were sleep deprived. We had a bunch of other things going on.
You think you're breastfeeding, you need to eat a lot of calories, and I literally got fat.
But we were taking this super low carb banana bread. I mean, there was one banana spread throughout like a giant cookie sheet of almond flour. And then we would put Kerrygold grass-fed butter on it, and we both gained like 10 or 15 pounds eating a super low carb diet. So you can overwhelm your ability to hang with the benefits of a ketogenic or low carb diet. And I know it's super controversial, but what I would throw out to people is that whether you are coaching folks or if you are trying to undertake this stuff on your own, if you're not getting the results that you want and you've historically been driving the boat focusing on the fat intake, just shift gears for 1 month and focus on that protein and use that free macronutrient calculator, figure out what your protein allotment is. And what's fascinating for folks, and I find this myself, is that if I'm hitting that protein allotment, it is hard for me to even eat the food that I'm supposed to eat. So I set my caloric level using the macronutrient calculator, and I just left it at sedentary. I didn't even add in my physical activity. So I'm taking in about 2,600 calories a day, and I've actually been weighing and measuring my food for the most part, and I've actually dialed my carbs down a bit because I've been as high as like 100, 120 grams certain days, but I'm playing with pulling that down a little bit. But what I really focused on was hitting that protein level, and I'm eating more protein, and it is hard as hell for me to eat the rest of the food. And so the flip side of that is it's very, very difficult for me to overeat on this process. And, it's funny when theoretically you're an expert on something, but you're still continually discovering, little tweaks and nuances on this. So again, I guess kind of a takeaway is that what we find is when people focus on the protein allotment first, they tend not to overeat. They tend to be very satiated. If you read Wired to Eat and you know a little bit about the neuroregulation of appetite, then you're going to understand that that's really where the rubber hits the road. And I know that there are a lot of groups out there that will say that fat is the only thing that you need to focus on. And if your ketones aren't at a certain level, you just need to eat more fat. And I'm going to say the controversial statement that those folks are getting subpar results for the bulk of their people. Now, if you're getting great results on that, God bless you, that's great. But what we've found in our practice is that if we have people focus on the protein piece, then they get much better success. And
I'm just going to interrupt because people are asking about the macronutrient calculator. And it looks like Jess posted a link.
Jess just posted
Keto Gains macronutrient calculator.
And this is what we use in the Keto Masterclass to help people find their macronutrient levels. We actually have a whole video module in how to navigate the calculator. It's not actually that hard. But doing customer service for people on the internet, you discover how incredibly obtuse some folks are with following basic instructions. So if you can figure out the macronutrient calculator on your own, that's great. If not, sign up for the Keto Masterclass, and we have a video module to kind of walk you through that. But I'll throw this out there as maybe an additional aside. We've been doing this stuff for like 20 years. And to the degree that we're successful, it's largely driven by the fact that we're able to help other people, like the very long, heartfelt email
Adam, and then the other one from Lisa.
Yeah, that Nikki shared. And so the reason why I'm focusing on this protein-centric approach is because it appears to work much better than focusing on the fat-centric approach. And there's even this, just this morning when I was moderating some comments, somebody was trying to be helpful to someone in the Facebook thread. And they basically said, hey, what you need to do is set your ratios like this. And so it was like 70% fat, 20% protein, or what have you, 10% carb, 5% carbs. The problem with that is that there's really no context for it. We don't know what the person weighs. We don't know what their protein needs are. We don't know what their lean body mass is. And so focusing on a specific ratio first what it ends up doing inevitably is that people overeat calories, overeat fat, undereat protein. And this happens again and again and again.
And well, this is reminding me of one of my sister's friends sent her a text and was like, I've been keto, I've been following this plan for 28 days
right.
or however long.
That's right.
And I'm so frustrated. I'm not losing any weight, and I can't eat any more food. I'm really full, but I'm doing it to a T. And so my sister sent me this, and she's like, you know, what recommendations do you have for her? And I'm like, well, I don't know what this plan is. I'm not familiar with it. Are there macronutrient recommendations, or what's the plan? And so it turns out that this is basically meal plans that are in keto ratios, and the recipe is made 4 servings. And so she was trying to do her best to divide them into 4 and eating 1 serving, but again, not tailored to her activity level, not tailored to her.
She's a small woman. She's a small female.
Her weight and height and body fat percentage and activity level and all of that. So in the end, she was eating far more than she needed, hence the lack of results that she was seeing.
And so we recommended that she use the macronutrient calculator, focus on protein, make sure that her carbs don't go above a certain level, and then basically add fat up to satiety. But, you know, with if there's one spot where people can fudge this stuff, it's actually you don't need to eat all the fat on this. And people freak out about that because there's the sense, again, in the interwebs that you need to eat a ton of fat to be in ketosis. But Dr. Ted Naiman has made the point that if you have a lot of body fat to burn, a chunk of that percentage of calories is going to come from body fat. And that's ultimately what we want. And there's, you know, the funny thing is you have some people who dismiss ketogenic diets and paleo and stuff like that. And they're like, it's just thermodynamics. It's just calories in, calories out. And clearly it's not that simple. Different calorie ratios, different foods have different satiety factors. They have different thermic effects. Protein has a very high thermic effect. And so just the calories that you can get from protein are comparatively few relative to carbohydrate and fat. And actually fat is the most easily stored macronutrient of any of them. Now that's, again, not to say that you should do a low fat, high carb diet. Doesn't work for me, doesn't work for a ton of people, but you do need to have some steeping in reality. And there is some sort of a middle ground here where thermodynamics do in fact matter. But at the same time, the satiety potential of things like a low carb diet, adequate protein, good amounts of fat from good sources, that's kind of where the magic happens. But it's a nuanced position, and it's not like this religious dogma that's like all fat all the time, you know, so not to beat that to
and
death.
So this is where you recommend in our 9 rules of keto, the rules are 1, keep your carb count, you know, under 25, 30 grams of carbs a day. 2, hit your protein target always. And 3, the fat macro acts as a lever. So eat that as you're hungry up to the limit. Obviously, you don't want to go beyond that. But if you're not hungry, you don't have to eat it all, right? Like you actually want to be able to access your body's stored body fat if your goal with going keto is fat loss.
Right. And Nick, you're asking which calculator do we recommend? The Keto Gains macronutrient calculator. Jess posted a link to that. So scroll back through the comments there. Charles, you're asking MCT oil and coffee in the AM. Who and what? Who are we talking about? What's the goal? It's always context driven. So it's just impossible for me at this point to give these kind of one size fits all recommendations when I don't know any context. In general, like I really like Bill Lagacoca's work over at Calories Proper, and he's kind of convinced me that eating more calories earlier is probably better because of circadian entrainment. Now I know that some people do great by an intermittent fasting schedule where they skip breakfast and then they eat their calories later in the day. That's awesome. I, for myself, have found that eating more calories earlier and then getting smaller and smaller amounts as the day goes by, I feel better. I just tend to be more grounded. So again, Charles, it's a good question. MCT oil and coffee in the AM. I don't know. It really depends on the specific situation.
And then we have a question from Michelle. With the carb target of 25 grams, is that net or gross?
Well, it's net carbs, and man, there was a big pissing match on our Facebook page the other day about this, but net carbs are just the carbs that are going to make it into your system, make it into your bloodstream, and that the pancreas is going to have to account for that with insulin. So that's really all that matters. We had somebody who was emphatic that fiber produces an insulin response. And in fact, fiber typically mitigates the insulin response. High fiber foods typically reduce the amount of insulin that is necessary to process the other net carbs, which is why we recommend a nutrient-dense approach to this with a low carbohydrate load, high nutrient value foods. David's asking, can you do keto and strongman? Yeah, I would check out Mark Bell over at Super Training. Mark has been super geeked out on a ketogenic diet for a long time. Huge guy, world champion powerlifter, elite numbers. Now, keto's not the right approach for everybody, but there are a lot of people finding some great success with a ketogenic diet and strength athletics specifically. I will throw out there that for the athletic story, glycolytic-based activity, CrossFit, jiu-jitsu, MMA, those sorts of things are challenging to fuel while ketogenic. Now, a lot of people are doing it. Again, leaning on the Ketogains guys, they use what's called a targeted ketogenic approach, where you get fat adapted for 2 to 3 months, eating a regular ketogenic diet. Then prior to training, you take anywhere from 10 to 20 grams of a fast-acting maltodextrin or a dextrose or something like that, and they take that about 10 to 15 minutes before that training event. And what they're finding is they maintain the fat adaptation, they maintain all that recovery and like kind of the resilience of having nice stable blood glucose levels, but they have that glucose for that low gear. And it's interesting because a lot of the studies by Finney and Volek and other folks suggest that a fat adapted athlete does not have depleted glycogen stores in the muscles. So this isn't potentially about the glycogen in the muscles. This may be a central governor feature. When you start exercising at a very high clip, even if you are fat adapted, your blood glucose is going to drop. And that drop may be stressful on the system to such a degree that we get an adrenal response, we get an elevation in cortisol and adrenaline, and then that is pushing some release of glucose out of the liver. And so what I'm thinking is happening here is that targeted ketogenic approach mitigates some of that stress response because we're taking in dietary carbohydrate right before the intense activity. And so it may be mitigating that because it really isn't an effect of muscle glycogen depletion, but I think it may be a central governor kind of feature. But whatever the story is, when people have been trying to do these high intensity activities, whether it's CrossFit, jiu-jitsu, what have you, and only being focusing on a standard ketogenic diet, they oftentimes have some serious problems, whereas this targeted approach is definitely working well.
We have another question from GT. Would going keto help with keeping gout flare-ups away? Yes.
Short answer is yes. Gout is 100% a metabolically driven condition. It is a hyperinsulinemic issue. If you just do a little bit of Google searching, gout, low carb, gout, ketogenic diet, there are actually some good randomized controlled trials where they've implemented low carb and ketogenic diets in folks with gout. And I mean, it's effectively within a few days, largely a cure for the situation. What freaks doctors out about a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet and gout is that it's not high protein, but it's adequate protein. Typically what they recommend that you do for gout, because the purines and pyrimidines that are found in protein-rich foods are kind of the substrate that feeds into the gout process. They recommend a low protein diet to limit the purines and pyrimidines. But the problem with that is all that you have left is fat and carbs. What's the thing that gets us in trouble more than anything else? Fat carb combos. So, it's a dead end street, the standard of care with dealing with gout. And so a higher protein, moderate protein, if you use the macronutrient calculator, I would put that at the moderate level, like the 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight is a good place to be. And then appropriate fat, limiting carbs, and you should have pretty remarkable results with that.
We have a question from Daniel about the best advice for night shift workers, inflammation, brain toxins, etc.
Man, Daniel, I would. So we've done a lot of work with police, military, and fire with the clinic that we have here in Reno. We've done a lot of pilot studies with these folks, and the shift work is just a crusher. And really the one lever that we have is a low carb diet. And what we find is that these folks are pretty inflamed, they're pretty insulin resistant, and kind of the one final lever that we have to tweak is that carbohydrate intake. So restricting carbohydrates, and then the sleep that you do get, you need to protect it at all costs, like a completely black room using something like Doc Parsley's sleep remedy, cold room, like all the sleep hygiene stuff. We have some sort of a resource for sleep or shift work, or no, I'm working.
We haven't released it yet. But
we haven't released it yet. I'm working on that. So I've been doing some work with the Chickasaw Nation, and they have a ton of shift workers. And so I've actually put together a whole kind of soup to nuts, how to deal with shift work deal. And we're kind of rolling it out to the Chickasaw folks first, but we will be rolling that out to you guys, and that'll be free as far as I know, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Derek, what's your take on metformin and keto? I mean, is there any benefit to increased insulin sensitivity while in ketosis?
You know, Derek, it's a really good question. I don't have a great answer for that. Metformin is interesting to me in that it mimics so much, or it brings about so many of the features that we would like to see in a well-formulated diet, whether it's ketogenic or otherwise. It is insulin sensitizing. It reduces intestinal permeability, interestingly, because it actually can cause some stomach upset in some people, but it mitigates intestinal permeability. It reduces LPS toxicity, which LPS is this highly toxic substance that comes off of the bacterial coats and is very inflammatory. It improves insulin sensitivity at the muscles. It mitigates excess glucose production in the liver. It does a ton of different things. It's really cool, but it's also a mild mitochondrial toxicant. And I don't know if you guys were able to catch any of my talks at the UCSF conference or at Low Carb Breckenridge talking about metabolic flexibility. I'll be talking about metabolic flexibility at PaleoFX. But one of the big drivers of the loss of metabolic flexibility is damage to our mitochondria. And there's a bunch of stuff that can do that. Antibiotics can damage the mitochondria, iron overload, sleep deprivation, gut dysbiosis, just the condition of being overweight causes an oxidative stress environment. There's a laundry list of things that are problematic. So the challenge for me with metformin is that it is a mitotoxin. So I'm kind of back and forth on metformin. I could make an argument for a super low dose and then maybe punctuated use, maybe use it for 1 week and go off for 3 weeks or something like that. If you're already low carb or ketogenic and you're doing maybe a little bit of time restricted feeding, you're lifting some weights, doing a little sprinting, I think that you're getting all of the kind of mechanistic activity that we would kind of get out of metformin, but maybe a little hormetic stress deal, throwing it in, it might be good, but I honestly don't know, and I'm a little nervous about it. It's funny, I've written multiple pieces about metformin, and if you go Google search Rob Wolf metformin, you'll find those articles. And so I'm a huge fan of metformin, but largely from kind of a mechanistic description of what's going wrong. When you look at what metformin fixes, then the implications of what you should do for diet and lifestyle are kind of obvious. Reduce carbohydrate intake, improve insulin sensitivity, all those things.
We have a question from Matt. What's your take on blood ketone levels? Do we need to show a certain number on the monitor to demonstrate that we are in ketosis? Lots of talk about blood ketone levels being lower after folks are keto for a while, or that lower levels indicate the body is using more ketones.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that this is where a lot of people have gotten themselves into some big problems by dosing themselves with excess fat and MCT and exogenous ketones and whatnot, trying to chase that number. And definitely what we found, and it took us a little while to pin down Drs. Finney and Volek on this story, but they too have noticed that over the course of time, people tend to not have as high of blood ketone levels. And what's happening here is kind of a twofold process. One is that the body is directly becoming much more efficient at burning fats for energy. So you don't need to convert them into ketone bodies to be able to utilize them. The other part of this story is that there's a dynamic equilibrium between acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And beta-hydroxybutyrate is actually kind of a storage form of ketones, and it typically will interconvert into acetoacetate to be used metabolically as a fuel. And so if we are driving more of the direct fatty acid metabolism that's going to reduce the amount of fat that would potentially need to go through the liver to produce ketone bodies. So I think that chasing ketones, other than the following situation: somebody who has a neurodegenerative condition, someone who needs a specific glucose to ketone ratio for cancer therapeutics, and Dr. Thomas Seyfried has talked about this quite a bit. And you look at that in millimolars, and for that kind of cancer prevention, you want a higher millimolar count of ketones than glucose. And usually you need to do some amount of fasting to affect that, like just a basic ketogenic diet won't even bring your blood glucose levels down low enough to get into that strike zone. But that's a really specific situation compared to 99% of people are just using ketogenic diet as a means of weight loss, and then potentially some kind of performance enhancements or maybe a little bit of resiliency because they don't like the blood sugar swings that occurs when you're eating a higher carb diet. But really, really good question. And again, in my opinion, this is where a lot of folks are making mistakes with the ketogenic diet and kind of undermining their efforts. They look at that blood ketone level and it's maybe in the 0.4 to 0.6 range. They feel great, but they feel like it needs to be up in the 1 or 1.5 range. And so then they start dosing themselves with a bunch of fat or MCT oil, and that's not really moving the needle in a good direction. I've been eating this way off and on for 20 years, and I've been really pretty strict with the lower end of the carbohydrate level, about 40 to 50 grams a day for close to a month. And I am never above 0.6, ever. Doesn't matter what I do. It does. I had food poisoning when I was at Low Carb Breckenridge. I didn't eat for literally 2 days. So it was a 48-hour fast, and I was at a 0.6. And so but I had great cognition. I couldn't experience hypoglycemia. I felt like shit otherwise, but everything else was otherwise good. But I think I'm so fat adapted that my body doesn't need to produce that high of ketone levels to meet the other needs that we have. And, just as an aside there, Marty Kendall over Optimizing Nutrition, he did a fantastic piece looking at acetoacetate versus beta hydroxybutyrate. And that's a really interesting treatment. So if you, again, do some searching, Optimizing Nutrition, optimal ketone levels, or Optimizing Nutrition acetoacetate, then you'll find that article. It's really good.
Let's see here. I had to take an antibiotic a few weeks ago for UTI. Can't seem to get my stomach right since. I'm craving more carbs and just can't seem to satisfy my hunger. I've been keto for 18 months.
Pamela, this is where I always want to ask a bunch more questions because it's super context driven. What I would recommend is kind of circling back around, though, and focusing on that protein allotment. Are you hitting that protein minimum? If you don't hit the protein minimum, it's going to be very, very hard to get the satiety that you want to just not be hungry. That's the place that I would start. I would definitely lean heavily on fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi. And if you use some fermented dairy, creme fraiche is kind of a good option in that regard. But I would make absolute certain that you're hitting your protein minimums. And then
making sure that your sleep hygiene is in order as well, because that definitely impacts cravings for carbohydrate. So
we have
let's see here.
Anelia, do you want to do that one?
Do you see that women may need higher carb intakes who have autoimmune disease? In practice, I see that women tend to bottom out faster on keto. How high for carbs?
Anelia, that's a really, really good question. And I don't know that I'm going to have a great answer on this. Here's it's observational, but it's interesting to me. When I did start digging around, trying to find people who were successful using a ketogenic diet for CrossFit and jiu-jitsu and MMA and stuff like that, the people that I found that were really doing well on just a basic ketogenic diet were women. And so it was almost no men, and it was a bunch of women. So on this one side, we saw the people who were doing the best with high intensity exercise and a ketogenic diet were women. But then also we definitely have seen, again, kind of anecdotal, but reports of more women kind of experiencing hormonal dysregulation and what have you. I have two thoughts on that. The first thought is that because a ketogenic diet is highly satiating it is easy to undereat. And so if we add a ketogenic diet plus overly hypocaloric scenario, women's metabolism is definitely very tightly tuned to their nutrient status. This is what drives their fertility signaling. And so it makes sense from biological perspective that if we don't have enough calories to be in a fertile condition, that we're going to shut things down and we're not going to be fertile right now. So if you're throwing both low carb and low calorie at the same time and potentially some high intensity training, that can be a huge problem. But another piece of this, which this is something that I learned from the Keto Gains guys, and that I thought I had it figured out, but I absolutely did not, is electrolytes. I was not getting in enough electrolytes. And what happens in that story, if we don't get enough sodium, particularly in this low carb scenario, our body starts wasting potassium and it basically excreting potassium. That means we start losing muscle. And in an attempt to maintain sodium balance, the body produces aldosterone, which causes us to retain sodium, retain water. But in the process of releasing aldosterone, it also releases adrenaline and cortisol. So a lot of people report that they have like super high heart rate and they can't sleep. This is always an electrolyte issue every single time. And again, like when I would make some forays into a little bit lower carb eating, I would get some of those effects. And I would say, well, I guess keto just doesn't really work for me because I was adding salt to my food and I thought I was being, diligent about it. And I wasn't. I just wasn't doing enough. So the two things that are of concern there is that for women is that you've got to get the electrolytes correct. Like there is no wiggle room on that whatsoever. You have to get the electrolytes correct. And even though we want a caloric deficit, we don't want a massive caloric deficit. So this is where it's pretty important to weigh and measure your food. And, if fat loss is the goal, then we can, introduce that mild caloric deficit, which again, that Keto Gains macronutrient calculator, it sticks in a mild caloric deficit, by just entering in all your information. So all that stuff said, if somebody's doing diligence on making sure that they're not overly caloric restricted and also that they're getting the electrolytes, if things are still just not working, just adding in 50, 75 grams of carbs a day and then otherwise, readjusting things, a lot of people do great with that.
I made the point that like low carb works for a lot of people.
Low carb works.
You don't necessarily have to be all the way keto to lose weight. For some people that's like the missing piece, but you can be low carb and eat 50 to 100 grams of carbs a day and make great progress.
Yeah. And that's a fantastic point, is somewhere in as powerful as keto is as a tool, somewhere along the line, we've gotten in this scenario where there's either ketogenic diets or it's like food pyramid, high carb, low fat, and there's nothing in between, which is kind of ridiculous. So even though I was making all these cases for how to modify a ketogenic diet to make sure that it's appropriate for somebody so that we don't end up with hormonal issues, there's absolutely a reality that if you just adjust carbohydrate up 75, 100, 120 grams a day and then readjust typically your fat intake, you're going to do great on that.
Especially if you're coming from eating 300-400 grams.
Right.
I mean,
right. In the keto masterclass, the recommendation that we make, if somebody's been on kind of a standard American diet or a very high carb diet, we recommend just doing kind of whole food paleo first, which makes it hard to even get above 200 grams of carbs a day. Like it's hard to eat that much sweet potato and squash and broccoli and everything. And so
unless you're doing like paleo brownies and cookies, which a lot of people do. So you got to watch that too.
Yeah, people can screw up just about
Yes,
anything. So yeah.
Okay, so we've had a couple questions about exogenous ketones. Like Steve says, I've been hearing a lot about it as opposed to pushing metabolism to produce them. What do you think about that?
I think exogenous ketones are going to be really valuable for a couple of different populations. Children with epilepsy, it may be really valuable because it's going to be hard. It is hard to get kids to eat an epileptic kind of macronutrient ratioed ketogenic diet. People with neurodegenerative diseases, particularly when they're in kind of later stage advancement, exogenous ketones are going to be valuable because oftentimes trying to get dietary change in someone who has Alzheimer's is almost impossible. Like they're already cognitively impaired and you have all kinds of problems going on there. For some athletes, exogenous ketones are going to be of benefit, but you use it in the context of a fat adapted keto athlete that then throws the exogenous ketones in the mix at the end. how do I want to say this somewhat tactfully? There are some folks that are really misrepresenting what you can get out of exogenous ketones. We have a lot of bandwidth. We could sell the pants off these things. I really kicked the tires on them. And I just didn't like what the results were. I'm the crazy guy who recommends that people eat food and chew it and swallow it. Like, I'm crazy that way. So
and eat good food.
Eat good food. Yeah. The hair splitting wife always. Nikki should have been a barber. She splits hair so much. But yeah, so there are definitely appropriate scenarios for exogenous ketones. One of the things I would love to see this, and we need a study to support it. Every single youth sports activity should have an exogenous ketone emergency kit. And when a kid hits a soccer ball and they get up and they're like kind of starry-eyed and everything,
concussion scenario.
Yeah, some sort of TBI concussion scenario, those kids should be given an exogenous ketone, and there should probably be like 4 or 5 doses that are followed up throughout the course of the next 3 or 4 days. And I suspect that would dramatically reduce the incidence of traumatic brain injury and a bunch of these different related problems. So I really like exogenous ketones for some very specific therapeutic interventions. But again, I'm that crazy guy that if you want this to be kind of a lifestyle and you don't want to waste time and money on things that aren't going to work and aren't going to set you up for success for years or decades, I don't know that the exogenous ketones are really the place to look. You need to look at fundamental diet and lifestyle changes and chewing your food and learning how to cook and building community, inviting friends over so that you guys all prep food and share it and, stuff like that. Getting sun on your body, all this stuff. Yeah. I really wish that you could just slug down some exogenous ketones and magic happens and like you just shed body fat and everything. That would be amazing because then I could retire and do my coconut farm deal. But I just haven't found that to be the case. So yeah, not to belabor that.
Let's see, a couple more questions and then I think we'll probably call it for today. Jody has a question. Do you have to use a glucometer? The strips are so darn expensive. Yes, they are.
The ketone strips in particular are quite expensive. They're nice in the beginning. Like if you were to do a few runs, part of what I like about the ketone strips, now I dislike them because people become neurotic and they start chasing ketone levels.
And then they find that they test at 0.4 and they think the world is ending because they've been keto for 2 months and now they're not registering.
Yeah, so they're frustrating in that regard. They're expensive and they can lead people down kind of a squirrely path. But in the beginning, they're kind of valuable because when you get a sense of like, okay, I'm feeling really good. Like I have really good cognitive function. I haven't been hungry in 6 or 8 hours and I'm motoring along great. And you check and you're like, oh, I'm at a 0.6 or whatever. Then you are able to kind of take the subjective feelings and put that into an objective measure and kind of marry those two things. So I think it's valuable in the beginning to get a little bit of external feedback on that, but then just throw it away. Yeah. Don't throw it away, but stick it up on the shelf. And every once in a while, if you want to check it, then do it. But I think people become neurotic and overly focused on kind of quantified self and monitoring. I really want people to just be in their skin, feel what's going on. And if you feel good, keep replicating what makes you feel good. If you feel bad, yeah.
And we have in the Keto Masterclass, we actually have a protocol and it's just for the first, I think 7 days where we're having people test. Right. And once you get into ketosis, then you can stop testing.
And part of it was because people are always curious. And so instead of punting that and saying, don't test, and then they follow all these squirrely protocols, we laid out exactly how to test and how to interpret what's going on. And again, I talked a lot about this in Wired to Eat. It's really valuable to take our subjective feelings and then wed that again with some objective measures so that we get a little bit of feedback from outside, but then we're able to really trust our own experience and understand when we're doing things well and when we're not. Like part of the reason why I've eaten in this low carb ketogenic way, and she's seen my neurotic spinning for 15 years now, is that I'll try to eat some more carbs and then I get on the carb roller coaster and I don't feel good and I have foggy headedness. I'm like, oh, I should be able to eat more safe starch. Paul Jaminet says, my gut's going to die if I don't eat this stuff. But at the end of the day, I look, feel, and perform well when I'm in this kind of circa ketogenic level, and I kind of dose carbs around jujitsu, and otherwise I feel pretty darn good.
And there's not a one size fits all, right? Like, so this is like what he's been experimenting with, and what all of you should do is what works for you, right? Like maybe the 25 grams of carbs isn't perfect for you. Maybe it's 60,
which is closer to where I'm at.
But this is some of that like feedback and, you know, the objective feelings that you get, or subjective feelings when you're eating food. Like how do you respond to the food, which ties all into the Wired to Eat stuff too.
Yep. Anything else? Should we shoot them a link to the Keto Masterclass?
Yeah, or maybe Jess can post a link in there, and we can pin that. And then we're going to try to do these a little more frequently. So if you guys have questions, we'll try to give you a little more advance notice when they're coming. We just kind of got to.
Yeah, we'll start sticking them in I know that there's a calendar scheduling function on Facebook, and so we'll start posting that stuff. If you guys go to robwolf.com, over on the side, you'll see the contact page there. You can fire off questions to us. That's where we will do the podcast Q&As.
Yeah, so the Q&A podcast episodes, we get those questions mainly from people who submit them on the website. So if you have questions, you can submit them there as well. We have our next Q&A podcast coming out on Thursday. So
cool. Oh, and real quick before we go, Dr. Michael Ruscio, Healthy Gut, Healthy You. I have seen this book coming out for the last 2 years. Dr. Ruscio has been working on this. I just can't recommend this enough. Dr. Ruscio is a brilliant guy, pretty handsome dude too. I do have to say, he's easy on the eyes. But again, you know, like my hashtag for 2018 is nuance, context, you know, and he is so good about that. Like it's is fiber good? Well, it depends. Is low carb good? Well, it depends. Are digestive enzymes good? Well, it depends, you know, and what's cool about this is he doesn't just say, well, it depends, and then leave you hanging. He actually provides a flow chart for like, well, if your situation is this, then do this or this. And based off those results, it's going to, you know, you go from A and you either go B or C. And then based off the results, you go C or D, you know, and so you've got this kind of logic tree that you go through. And it is just amazing. It's super easily accessible. If you are pretty sophisticated and you're like a trainer, you have a medical background, you will get a ton out of this. If you're a complete layperson, you will get great information out of this. It's written to engage both sides. I'm just going to show. He takes a ton of really complex information and makes some great infographics so that, you know, it makes it more accessible. So again, just plug in this Healthy Gut, Healthy You, Dr. Michael Ruscio. Cannot recommend that enough.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks guys.
Everybody.
Okay, take care.
All right.